Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. Today's video is going to be about 13 tips to keep in mind if you are sewing with kids. I love sewing with my daughter. She's 8 now. We've been sewing together since she was about 4 or 5, getting incrementally more, doing things on her own and advanced as we go. And over that time, I've come up with some ideas to make things easier, both for your child and also for you, so you don't get stressed out and you guys can enjoy the experience together. These aren't in any particular order, so just take them and incorporate them so that you can pass your love of sewing onto the little ones in your life. All right, our number one tip for working with kids when they're learning to sew is to consider the ergonomics. So when my daughter first started sewing when she was about 4 or 5, she couldn't reach the foot pedal. So what we started doing would I would sit her in my lap and I would run the foot pedal and then she would steer things. As she got a little bit older and was capable of running the foot pedal on her own, she still couldn't reach the floor. So what we often would do is I would put her on a pillow to seat her up a little bit higher, so that way she was more in line in a right ergonomic angle with sewing so that she didn't get sore doing it. And also I would put the foot pedal on the same step stool that we use in our bathroom so they can reach the sink. That way everything was raised up a little bit to work for her smaller body, so that way she would have a good time sewing and would be able to run the machine on her own. All right, my number 2 tip for working with kids for sewing is to consider their attention spans. So you don't want to pick a project that can't be done in little spurts. You want to make sure that if they're younger that you can sew for 20 or 30 minutes and come to a good natural stopping point. As they get older, that time will increase. My daughter's in 3rd grade now and is 8 years old, and she can sew for about an hour before she gets bored with something. But when we first started, it was more like 20 or 30 minutes. So I wanted to make sure that we could stop at any time. We would be able to pick things up when she was starting to get bored with it, because you don't want it to be like a forced activity. You want it to be something that they're really enjoying. And when they're in the mood to do it again, you can pick it up easily and get going with that again. When we made her first quilt, it probably took about 6 months to do it. Not because it took a long time for her to sew, but because she only had the attention span to do maybe 30 minutes at a time, and we weren't working at it all the time. It was only when she was in the mood to do it. My number 3 tip for working with kids is to make sure that they're using fabric that they love. While you may be tempted to just take your cast-offs and the things that you regret buying and just throw something haphazardly together because that's extra and you don't have to like use the good stuff, that may not be what excites them. When my daughter was young, well before she was ready to sew, I would collect things like charm packs and jelly rolls and fat quarter bundles of kids' prints that I knew she would love. Lots of unicorns, lots of rainbows, mermaids, anything with super bright colors that I knew she would really enjoy working with. And when the time came for her to actually be able to sew those together, I said, here is your stash. And we worked with, her first project was a bunch of charm packs that she just sewed together in an 8x12 configuration to make a lap quilt that's perfect for her. She still sleeps with it at night. And I didn't put any ramifications on it. I was like, just sew whatever you want, however you want it to go together. So she had her own little drawer in the desk that was her fabric. She loved it all. She could pick from whatever she wanted from it, and it was already cut to size. So that's what I kind of recommend to you, is that you go with things that they're really going to get excited about. We have a new collection called the Unicorn Love, which may be something that they're excited about, but look for the things that they're interested in. Like my daughter now is getting really into Pokemon, and so we got a fleece blanket that we're going to serge the edges of to make a nice soft blanket for her. So you want to make sure that it's something that they're going to love, they're going to get excited about. Like she saw one fabric that she thought would make a perfect Mal costume for the Disney Descendants, and so she's very excited and very thrilled about it. So you just need to like let them lead, and if they think your fabric is ugly, don't take it personally. They just have different tastes than you, and let them go with what they're excited about. All right, my number 4 tip for sewing with kids is to consider using clips instead of pins when you get started. My daughter was very afraid of pins. She doesn't like shots, she doesn't like needles, she didn't want to get poked with anything. And so when we first started, what we used are the Quilter's Perfect clip in order to keep things together at the seam joins. And it's something that she could work herself, she could get everything together and in the right spot, and then she doesn't have to worry about being fear of poking working it herself. Now, as she's gotten older, we do use pins now. That fear has gone away. But at first, that was a really good option for us, especially if you're sewing a longer piece together, because then you're not going to have it like poke you. You know that happens when you're sewing. You've got long things. You're going to stab yourself. It's going to happen. But you don't want to have your kids have a bad experience. So consider the clips instead. All right, my number 5 tip for sewing with kids is to consider pressing your seams to the side, so underneath, instead of pressing them open. I know if you've watched my videos, you are probably gasping with disbelief because I am a huge proponent of pressing seams open. But when you are a true beginner or when you're working with kids, it is really easy to nest that seam when they're both pressed in opposite directions. And it just makes it easier for them to get the hang of it, doing it themselves, because that's ultimately the goal. We don't want to create a project where we have to do 90% of the work and have them not have that much in it. We want them doing as much as they are capable of doing at that stage in their development. And so if you're pressing seams to the side, it just makes it easier for them to match up that join, get a good join, and be proud of it because they did it themselves. Once they get older, you can work on pressing seams open once they are a little bit more skilled with putting things together and using pins. All right, my number 6 tip for working with kids is to start small. You do not want to start with the giant twin-size quilt for their bed. You want to do little things. Some of the first projects that I made with my daughter that she really loved were Quilt As You Go placemats, and she ran the sewing machine herself for that, picked which fabrics were going next, and everything was crooked and out of place, but it didn't matter. She loved it, and she used that for many years, eating off of at the dinner table. We also have done doll quilts. Her biggest project to date has been a charm pack quilt where she had a rows of 8 by 12, and that was perfect because we could work. She could get a row or two together and then be done for a little while, and when she was in the mood again, we could do a couple more rows. So you want to make sure that they're easy to complete projects so they can have those moments of gratification pretty quickly, because you want them to be excited about it and being excited to do more. But work up to that. So the Quilt As You Go placemat, it uses a jelly roll, and that's free on our website. You can watch a tutorial of me doing it, plus one of me doing it with my daughter for some inspiration. My number 7 tip for sewing with kids is to use a sewing machine that has a speed control if possible. My machine has this where you can choose a slow, medium, and fast speed. And it's perfect because when they first get started off, you can start them out on the very low speed because they haven't driven a car yet. They have no concept of going light on that foot pedal so that it doesn't go super fast. So if you can set it to where they can press the pedal to the floor and it still is not going to go very fast at all, that's perfect for them. And as they get more comfortable with it and you are less concerned about them stabbing themselves with a needle, then you can gradually increase that speed to something that's a little bit faster. My daughter at 8 is about the medium speed right now, and that is good for her. All right, my number 8 tip for sewing with kids is to not worry about everything being perfect, but at the same time, don't be afraid to say, okay, this seam does need to be redone. Because our goal is not to have them create a perfect project, because let's face it, we don't really create perfect projects either. There's always going to be a mistake somewhere. But if it's something where it's going to damage the integrity of the quilt, like the seam is way too skinny, it's okay to have them redo that part and explain why that section needs to be redone. Or like when my daughter was doing her first lap quilt, her first couple of rows, she hadn't gotten the hang of the 1/4 inch seam yet. So she had like 1/2 inch seams on some of these. And so when we were getting to the point of sewing everything together and she had done her 12th row and she had mastered the 1/4 inch seam, I was looking at it and I showed it to her and I was like, look, you can make the decision. We can sew it together as is, or we can redo these couple of seams on your first couple of rows because they're not going to fit together and we're going to have to cut your whole quilt down in order to make it fit. So it's your decision, but it's going to look better if we take a little bit of extra time to redo this section from when you got started because you're much better now. And she did make the decision to redo those sections so that way everything would fit together much better. But when you can either make the decision of we really do need to redo this because it's going to not hold up for you, or just say it's your choice. You've gotten better since you started. Do you want to redo this section or do you want to leave it as is? But don't ever insist that it absolutely be absolutely perfect because you're just going to turn them off. You don't want to be the first quilt police they run into. You just want to be encouraging to them, and if it's not perfect, that's okay. My number 9 tip for working with kids is not to tell them that they can't do something because they're not ready. That's fear of not being able to technically accomplish something. That's something we learn as adults. The kids don't have that. And you will be surprised at what they create if you just let them go. I let my daughter long arm her first quilt. It was a little scary because it was like turning over the keys to my minivan because they cost the same amount of money. But after a couple of discussions about how the machine is not supposed to go vroom, she was actually doing pretty good with it. And she wanted to create unicorn horns that had swirls in them because she was doing something different with each pass. And I was like, honey, I think that would be a little hard to do. Why don't we just do some triangles? And so she did that. And then she's like, I'm going to do it. And doggone it, she did a pretty good job filling in those unicorn horns with swirls. So don't tell them no. Just say, okay, let's give it a go and see how it goes. And assist them wherever they need it, because obviously some things like cutting and pressing, they may not just be ready for because of safety concerns. But if it's something where they're not technically ready for it, but they want to give it a try, go ahead and let them give it a try. It's all about the creative process for them. All right, my number 10 tip for sewing with kids is to determine what you should do and what they should do based on their attention span and also safety. So for example, I'm still cutting everything out for the quilts, and I also do all of the pressing. I do all of the cutting because I don't want my daughter at 8 using a rotary cutter yet because they can be a little dangerous. Also, the table is too high for her. And also, I know that that's something she's not going to have any joy in. She's going to have more fun putting it together than cutting it out. So I want her to be able to get straight to the fun part. So I always do all the cutting before we sit down to sew. That way she can get right into the fun part and have the enjoyable moment of the actual sewing. For pressing, I think she probably could do it now, but I'm still kind of hanging on to that because I think she would find it boring. And she has pressed some stuff, but it just worked really well the last time we were working on a quilt for her to do all the sewing and for me to do all the pressing, because it kept everything moving along really quickly. And then she could be engaged, and for the hour that we sat down to sew, she was able to get a lot accomplished because we were kind of tag teaming it. So think about, for your child that you're working with, what are they capable of doing right now, and what are they capable of sitting through right now, and what part should you do ahead so that way they can have a more enjoyable time doing it for that prep work. All right, my number 11 tip for sewing with kids is to pick projects that your kids are into sewing, even if it's not something you're into or have had any experience in whatsoever. So they may not be into doing applique or heirloom quilting or whatever it is that is your jam. They may want to make pillows. They may want to make doll clothes. They may want to do a cosplay Pikachu costume. Who knows? Last year we made this entire Poison Ivy outfit for my daughter. And these are things that are not in my sewing skill set all the time. They're not things that I do always, but they are fun to do. You're going to learn something. You're going to have a great time working with them to create it. And you're just going to have a really fun time. And maybe later down the line, they'll get into the same things you're into. But at the beginning, you just want to foster that love of sewing and give them a creative outlet. And so it doesn't matter if they're doing quilting per se, because that's what you do. As long as they're doing something that is involving a sewing machine, they're getting comfortable with the process and they're having a good time with it. All right, my number 12 tip for sewing with kids is to praise them often. You definitely are going to have moments you're going to be like, okay, that was good, but we need to work on this. Make sure you know your 1/4 inch seam is a little bit more steady. Let's work on repinning this. But you have to always do that in a constructive way, and you have to make sure that you're praising them far more often than you're making suggestions to fix stuff, because we want them to have a good experience. We don't want to feel like we're constantly criticizing them when they're doing it. And that doesn't mean that we have to go over the moon so that everybody's a winner or whatever, but you just want to make sure that they're being praised when they're doing a good job, because they are. They're having a good time, they're learning something, and we want them to enjoy that and feel like we're proud of them for what they've created. All right, my 13th and final tip is to have fun. So this can be a little stressful on the adults, I think, more than anything when you're teaching kids to sew. I very much remember sewing my very first doll clothes with my grandma from start to finish, and I remember frustrating her very much. She was from Italy and she did not read or write in English. And so I was the one reading the pattern. She was a very accomplished seamstress, so she didn't really need the pattern. She could have just done it without looking at it. But I was, at the time, I wanted to follow everything step by step, and I could tell that that was really frustrating her. And you might be really concerned, like I was, giving my daughter, you know, access to the long arm. It's like, oh my God, like, are you gonna break this thing and it's really expensive? Like, you might be internally feeling stress about it and their attention span or lack thereof, but you need to have as much fun as possible so that they can have as much fun as possible, because they do sense those things, and I want it to be just such a positive experience for them so you can pass that love of sewing onto them. So back to things like knowing when it's time to quit and wrap it up. For me, I can always tell when my daughter's had enough when her quarter-inch seams get sloppy, because I know she's capable of doing a really good one, but when it starts to get sloppy, I know she's had enough and it's time to take a break. So get to know what those cues are, so that way you can cut it off and wrap it up and come back to it another day when they're excited and into it, and never force it. Just make sure that you guys are both in the mood for it, that you're having a good time, because you want them to be able to rely on this as a creative outlet for the rest of their lives. And if you make it not fun for them now, they're not going to want to do it later. So that is the most important thing for them and for you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my 13 tips for sewing with kids. We have actually a crafting with kids section that we have ignored for several years, but we have several things that I did with my daughter when she was itty bitty, and we actually are filming right after I film this one a new tutorial where she is going to be doing all the sewing. So that is very exciting to watch her progression, but we didn't start out that way. We started out with her doing, 20-30 minutes and being, farting a frying pan onto something else. So that'll develop over time, their attention span and their attention to detail. At the beginning, it's just important that you guys are having a good time, and it doesn't matter if the finished project is any good at all, as long as they've had a good time making it. So have fun with your littles. I would love to see what you're making with them. You can tag us on all the socials. We're at Quilt Addicts Anonymous on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. So come find us there and let me see what you're making with the little ones. Until next time, happy quilting.